Good morning, and thank you to Mr. Philip Dunne for your time today. Today we're going to talk about how we can help improve the operation of sewer networks and get the view from Philip Dunne, who is head of the Environmental Audit Committee. I'm going to hand over the meeting now to Mr. Lloyd Martin, who's the former Chief Executive of British Water and also a board member of the Filta Group.
Thank you. Philip, thank you for joining us. And maybe if I just set the scene very briefly, I retired from British Water, the trade association for the supply chain, some 3 years ago now, nearly. And prior to that, I'd worked for both Severn Trent and Anglian. So my history is really in the water industry most of my life. And for good or bad, I've worked on all sides of the water industry in terms of working with, working for, and alongside water companies. And Filta asked me to join the board. I was very pleased to do that in retirement. So may I start off by asking if you could briefly update us on how what was your private members bill has progressed. I believe it has transformed into something perhaps more immediate. I'd be very grateful if you could just tell us what the current status is.
Sure. Well, thank you, Lloyd, and thanks for inviting me to talk to you today. So the private members bill, which I introduced in February 2020, survived for the duration of the parliamentary session, which ended in April 21, without getting to a debate on the floor of the House as a consequence of repeated delays. I think we had 5 dates allocated through the year, and the COVID consequences of Parliament being disrupted meant that I never got to have a debate on it, which was, as you can imagine, disappointing. So from about January of this year, I have been actively working with officials in DEFRA and the Environment Minister specifically on how we could try and convert as many of the proposals in my bill as we could into the Environment Bill that was also delayed as a result of COVID. And instead of being passed ahead of the Brexit date, it's still progressing through now the House of Lords. And what I'm delighted by is that the ministerial team and the department have picked up many of the measures in my bill and have introduced them as by and large government amendments into the House of Lords, which capture much of the substance of what I was trying to achieve. Not everything, because the bill that I produced was effectively a Christmas tree bill, which is a sort of technical parliamentary term which sort of says as it sounds. It picked up a lot of things, and it was a very wide-ranging bill for a private members bill, and not all of those things have been taken forward. So specifically related to the interests of your members, the clauses in my bill relating to banning products with plastic in them, like wet wipes, has not been carried forward into the bill, and nor have measures directly addressing the whole issue of blockages through fatbergs and so on. So that may be disappointing to your some of your members. It may be a relief to some others, but the reality is that they were rather too sort of detailed measures to go into the Environment Bill itself, which is the biggest piece of environmental legislation that we've had in this country since we joined the EU, and is designed really to set the major policies rather than detailed regulations surrounding individual items. So I mean, that's where it is. The Environment Bill has now finished its committee stage, and the Lords is due to have its report stage on the 13th of October. And then we'll come back to the Commons. And I think the government remains determined to try and get it onto the statute book before this important conference on COP26 starts in Glasgow at the beginning of November.
Thank you. Well, clearly, on the one hand, the news is good for the overall side of what you were looking for, but specifically, I'm guessing for what we were going to explore today, the news is less good. So I don't know whether that makes it the sewer is half full or the sewer is half empty. I'm not sure. But there still seems to be therefore work to do in terms of engaging with water companies in terms of the way they manage the assets and the way they encourage operators upstream to hopefully not pollute and block sewers. So I wonder if you could tell us how far at the moment you've engaged with water companies specifically, and then maybe the water industry as a whole in terms of your discussions with them in terms of the problems specifically of blockages due to fatbergs.
So, sort of separate to my private member's bill, I'm also chairman of the Environmental Audit Committee, and that committee launched an inquiry into water quality in rivers focused pretty much on water company activities rather than other sources of pollution, although we've just had a session with some of the farming representatives and we've spoken to local authorities for sort of surface water runoff and pollution coming from drainage systems that they have responsibility for. But it's mostly focused on water companies, and we have the water company chief executives appearing before our committee coincidentally on the 13th of October. So we will be including in our questioning of water companies sort of formally through the committee a series of questions, I'm sure, about sources of pollution incidents and in particular blockages. As a result of that inquiry, I'm not sort of personally engaging directly with water companies other than through the committee at the moment, because it's just not appropriate to do so. We have, as a committee, visited one of the sites. We went to Thames Water sites in Oxfordshire as a sort of official visit, and we looked at the treatment plant, we saw the material that was being extracted at the plant, we went into the river, we were the River Windrush, where we saw some of the outfalls and materials, in particular microplastics that were found on the riverbed, having gone right through a treatment plant process, and that's another it's a contributory factor perhaps to blockages, but it's not a main source of it because they tend to get carried away by the flow of the water, but it's clearly another source of pollution. So the issue remains live. You said in your introduction that I can explain what the government is doing. Well, I can't really, because my job is to scrutinise what the government is doing. And at the moment, they've not come out with any specific measures to address blockages. And I think one of the sort of interesting subjects to discuss at the conference, which the Trade Association is having in Brighton in a few weeks' time, is what should the industry be doing to try to improve its own self-regulation and standards in case, in order to get ahead of any potential government action in due course to try to impose regulations on the sector.
Thank you. I mean, it's a very pertinent question, and it's something that comes up within the industry as a whole from time to time. I was involved about 25 years ago with an initiative to do with the reduction of leakage. And in those days, it was very much a Cinderella part of the industry. It wasn't popular. It wasn't well capitalized in terms of companies, leaving leakage at levels that would nowadays be unacceptable. But what happened was that there was almost like a top-down message got through from both government, but also organizations similar to something like the Audit Committee, specifically Ofwat, were letting companies know that this couldn't continue. And the water companies were incredibly proactive in those days, recognizing the problem and setting up a industry-wide approach to try and reduce leakage in a whole series of ways, one of which was not to specify particular equipment, but to specify techniques and technologies that would be good practice to adopt in order to reduce leakage and improve water supplies. This seems to me a very similar situation that we now find ourselves in terms of fatbergs, and not the world's most glamorous subject, but one that is incredibly important. So I agree with you. I think the FOG Forum will be a great place to start to explore this, and hopefully not only get the water companies who recognize the problem and are working on it almost from the bottom up, but also regulators, audit bodies looking at it from the top down. So hopefully this will be something that we can pursue actively together. Thank you. I wonder.
Can I just pick that up, Lloyd? I think your analogy with the approach that the water companies took to leakage issues is a really pertinent one, because I think that is going to be the way in which some real progress is made here. There are a number of technologies emerging which are starting to address the issue of fatbergs in a rather different way, and I think if there can be some kind of industry recognized, I don't know whether kite marking is a bit too grand a term, but a means of establishing what is good practice, which can then be spread across the water sector. I think that would be a great step forward.
And I certainly think that it was fascinating at the time to see the views of the individual water companies, whom you will know are autonomous and frequently don't necessarily think from a commercial point of view it is always good to share information. They dropped the barriers, removed the silos from their own activities with leakage, and really did work together. Absolutely think there's no reason to not hope they could do the same now.
Well, it's a common problem, isn't it? And anybody who's developed a good method of addressing that problem, should be keen to encourage others to do so as well, because it's not a competitive thing, really. It's a collaborative thing.
Well, it should be a win-win, and hopefully, that's a good way forward. One thing I did wonder was whether or not you'd had any engagement with Water UK.
I have. I've spoken at a couple of their events, and we've invited them, and they've appeared before our committee. So we have had engagement with Water UK, yes, indeed.
Yeah, because obviously they, in a sense, for yourself and for your committee's point of view, they could be a single point of contact for the majority of the water operators who are active in the country. So that would be good too. So I think keeping them on board would be excellent. Good. I suppose the other side of it is whether or not you feel there's any areas in which contractors such as Filta, working in the Greece contracting agency, whether you think there are things that we could do to help solve the problem, over and above the commercial side of simply trying to provide equipment to solve it. Are there things that you think contractors as a whole could do in terms of anything that you would like to put to them?
That's a good challenge. Well, again, I think it comes down to trying to identify things that work well and are cost effective. So if Filta have products that address the problem and can help those who are creating the problem to understand what they're doing. So spreading best practice, perhaps at the other end of at the start of the problem, where the fog is emerging, from food service or wherever it's coming from, and engaging with your customers. It's a bit challenging because, as you say, it is a commercial environment. So you will have competitors also trying to sell their products into the same audience. So that's where I think trade associations and industry bodies working together is a really good way to do it. And I think for individual companies, it's a matter of trying to promote your products to the trade association, get the trade association to put together a sort of portfolio of capabilities that the industry is offering, and then spread that to both the upstream, the food establishments, and downstream, if that's the right word, to the water companies, is would be a holistic way to try and approach this. I think it's quite difficult to promote one individual company solution as against others. So I think if the trade associations were to set out the portfolio and then allow the individual clients to decide what suits their model best, that's kind of how it works in a capitalist economy.
I wonder if I could actually, if you don't mind, Philip, bring in Edward here in terms of the work that I know he's been doing on codes of practice. Do you feel, Ed, that there are things that could be sort of dovetailed into both?
Absolutely, and I think certainly the Greece Contractors Association, of which we're a member, I think that a lot of good work has gone into building the best practice documentation, and I think there's other documents circulating within the industry. I think it's really important that it's brought together and put into action. And I think at the moment it's still fragmented in our industry. And like you mentioned, Lloyd, with leakage detection, fundamentally there's a problem to solve. And actually what we need to do is come together as best practice suppliers, contractors, stakeholders, and work to solve that problem and build a solution. And I still think there's some work to do on that front, and whether from Philip's perspective, whether Philip, whether you've got a view, whether there's something you can do to try and coordinate that, to put the contractors and the suppliers in front of the water companies. I think I'd be keen to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's not really my role to intermediate within an industry, but what I think I can do when chairing my committee with the water company chief executives in front of me is to challenge them as to what work they're doing to try and address this issue, and to what extent do they engage with your trade organisation, or the Greece Contractors Association, or individual members, and see how big a problem they think it is, and whether what they're prepared to do about trying to fix it. I can certainly do that, and we'll plan to do that when I see them next month.
That's great.
Actually, it's the day before the conference that I'm speaking at, so I may be able to bring some fresh news.
Oh, fantastic. Because certainly the water companies have a different perspective, different operating models, and like leakage, it's the same for everybody. So I think it's pooling that information and resources to best endeavours, really, and best effect. But look forward to hearing an update when we meet in Brighton.
And I think just to sort of conclude on this particular issue, the important thing to always bear in mind is that in many cases, contractors such as Filta and similar providers of equipment are often one step removed from the water companies, because there are subcontractors to the companies who come in and do their own auditing of the situation. So there's often this link between those who need it ultimately for the management of the sewer and those who provide the actual equipment to reduce the loading on the sewer. The bit in between is often policed by those organisations whom the water companies employ to go out and do the work that used to be done by trade effluent inspectors. And so I think there is that slight gap that would be very useful to bring together. So I'll leave that with you as a thought, if I may.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Lloyd.
Thank you very much. I really do appreciate that. And thank you for setting up the meeting, Edward, and for your time, Philip.